Now it looks like we got a few folks trickling in. This is going to be great. For the folks who are in here already, we are having a Q&A portion at the end. So better to get your questions in sooner rather than later. And please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom and not the chat. They will get lost in the chat. So please use the Q&A feature. And we will get to those since those will probably be first.
Yeah. Awesome.
Okay, I think we're live. I mean, it is time. It's time to get started. So we'll still wait a little bit for folks to trickle in, but Ben and Fish, so happy to have you guys here. Thank you for joining. Super excited to hear from you guys on data consultants, some of the challenges y'all have faced, some of the wins you guys have had. So definitely excited to dive deep into that subject, and specifically around the SMB space. For folks, I see more folks are coming in. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom app or on the Zoom, and not in the chat. They will get lost. And I think we can get started. We have plenty of folks in here, so let's get into it. The title of today's chat is Navigating the Data Consultant SMB Landscape. Some of the topics we want to talk about are, first of all, what exactly is it that data consultants do? What are they hired to do? And what are companies looking for? Client acquisition and retention, pricing strategy, and costs of data stacks. So if you have any questions around that, please submit them in that Q&A feature on the chat. I'll go ahead and do some intros here. Super excited to have Peter Fishman, aka Fish, co-founder and CEO of Mozart Data. Prior to Mozart, he worked as a data consultant for SMBs and enterprises like GoDaddy. He has also worked in data and data leadership roles at fast-growing startups, including Opendoor, Zenefits, Microsoft, and Disney. He has been deeply involved with the modern data stack space as a consumer, consultant, investor, and now entrepreneur. So Fish, thank you for doing this. Excited to hear from you. Ben, super excited to have you here. Ben is known as the Seattle data guy. He has spent his career focused on helping companies develop end-to-end data solutions that are simple and maintainable. He has worked in various industries and companies like Facebook as a data engineer. He has helped companies develop modernize and migrate their data infrastructure. He has migrated companies off of old ETL systems, found the right solutions, and turn their data into value. If anyone here is unfamiliar with Ben, go look him up on LinkedIn. He puts out great content. He's super entertaining. He's fantastic. So honored to have you here, Ben. I think let's just jump right into it. We'll start with our first topic. What exactly is a data consultant? What do they do? And why do companies hire them? I think whoever wants to go first, Fish, you might want to kick us off here.
Well, I was going to pass instantly to Ben.
Okay,
All
let's
right,
do it.
More recent of
Sure.
a data consultant.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of reasons why people hire data consultants. And in terms of like what we are, I guess, generally, my view is we help companies kind of, again, find the right solutions, sometimes implement them. I can get called on multiple levels. Sometimes people just want me to come in and give them what the answer is, and then they're going to build it. Or sometimes they want me to come in and build data pipelines and data warehouses and provide analytics. I think it's easier probably to talk through maybe some projects. I feel like the projects I often get pulled into are things like what I call like key person dependency issues. So this is someone built something a year ago, they quit, and now no one knows how it works. I think last year, like 30 or 40% of my projects were in that space. Where it's just like, we need someone to come in, simplify this, or help us understand what's going on. We want this to keep existing, but we currently can't maintain it. Another often thing that I get brought into is just like, we don't have the expertise, or we want someone to kind of just kick us off in the right direction. Meaning either they have a data stack or they want to switch data stacks, they have nothing, and they would like someone to come in and just lay the foundation for something that they can then hire a full-time employees to kind of come in and build on top of. And so I think that's another common place where it's like they are trying to bring someone in that's built a data stack from the ground up multiple times, right? Like that's the real thing I think people hire consultants for, is your prior experience. And so knowing that you've probably done something 100 times that maybe a full-time employee only has to do once or twice is another reason people will hire you. Because they're like, hey, you can do this because you've done it so many times, we can hire someone else to maintain it instead. So that's often another thing that I think a lot of people pay for, is just your experience and your knowledge in a space. Similar thing can be said about like migrations, which is another common project. Again, a lot of people don't have to do it that often, right? It happens every year or two. And so if you're that person that's doing a 90-day, six month very, very continually, you're very valuable because you can make sure that this very high value project is successful at the end. So that's kind of what I do as a consultant, but I'd love to kind of hear maybe Fish, your take as well.
Yeah, I think first off, we want this content to be valuable to the aspiring consultant, to the existing consultant, and at the most basic level, folks hire consultants or part-time or fractional work because maybe they don't envision enough work for a full-time, or maybe the ROI on expensive expertise is good in a small piece, but maybe not for a company for an extended period of time. So in general, this is just consultants more broadly, not data consultants more specifically. The idea is that a small amount of work will have typically an immense ROI, because when you hire someone in a fractional setting, tends to be a little bit more expensive than basically hiring that person as a full-time perpetual employee at the company. So the context for me to get hired as a consultant are pretty similar to what I just stated, which is they wanted like fractional expertise. I think you mentioned a big chunk of your projects there. Actually, it was a little bit surprising for you to say, in practice, a big chunk of my project work is to clean up almost somebody else's mess. So I think people often have the perception about that first case that I mentioned, which is there is some level of expertise that's missing and needed, and then you with all your great big company and small company and data consulting experience could come in and just like paint the brush with the right solution, and then they'll be off to the races and never need to really maintain it in any sort of difficult or challenging way. I think that those end up being in hindsight, a very small fraction of the type of work that you get done. Typically, there's some sort of groundwork that's been done, some of which can be productive, some of which can be counterproductive. And, you have to go in and assess what the right next step is. And sometimes it's to break it all down and start afresh. Sometimes it's to have sort of a little bit of a bridge. And sometimes it's to do sort of a longer, more elevated project to get us to a healthy place. So, interesting that you mentioned that. It wasn't sort of what I was, where my mind goes, but I think that ends up being more of the reality.
Yeah.
So to that end, obviously you had done this work as an internal consultant. So, when you are working at a company like Facebook, you're working as a data consultant in a permanent context, right? So there's some, objective that, a business unit has or a team has, and, you're effectively building that. But at some point you decided to make the jump of hanging your own shingle. Why? You had such a cushy life. It was great. What's wrong with you?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, financially, it made sense. I think I also enjoy like stepping away from finances. I get to experience a lot more different problem sets, right? Like when you're working for a company, you're very much like, this is the team that I work for. These are the problems that I solve, right? You can't necessarily expand beyond that. You can't experience like all these various tool sets, right? If you work at a FANG, you experience a very limited perspective of the data world. It's a very privileged area of the data world. Like they have data problems, but they're infrastructure is generally more mature. They're a little more along the way. So you don't get to see things from maybe a little more ground up position. You're kind of like, okay, we already have data infrastructure. Cool. But working as a consultant gave me that perspective where it's like, okay, I got to see what, like, I don't want to say real people's problems are, but like people outside of like tech's problems are, which are very, very different than big tech. I mean, they're not that different, but they're in different situations. So there's that. I also get to experience a lot more, like, I don't just have to work on data problems, right? I have to work on people problems more so, which was somewhat the case at Facebook, but I think also more so, as you grow as a consultant, you have to figure out, okay, what are the different types of projects I want to take on? If I want to make, if I want to find projects that are higher value, what does that look like? And generally that means figuring out how to have higher impact, which also then involves, more people problems than it does purely data problems. So I think there's a ton of reasons why, and it gives me more growth, let me kind of define a little bit more of what I'm doing. Obviously it's financially been beneficial. Also I can be wherever I want a little more, right? No more like the last like 9 months of Facebook was definitely like you guys have to move back to SF soon. And I'm like, okay, well, could you tell me when? Because I'm playing this back and forth. But yeah, I think those are a lot of the reasons why I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to try consulting. I think the other reason, and this is less the reason why, but the reason that I had confidence was I felt more confident in my skill set that if I didn't, like, if in a year it didn't do what I wanted it to do, I was like, at this point, I'm confident enough I can get another job at another, large tech company that can, make sure that I'm, staying where I want in terms of like growth. So that was very helpful at that point. So.
Sure. And I can speak to the MFANG experience. So I, sort of having worked in Microsoft, there's sort of a stack at Microsoft, the sort of Microsoft stack that is sort of widely used throughout the company that you develop deeper and deeper expertise into. And that sort of translatability to certainly small companies, you certainly lose a little bit of your edge in that respect in a way that you'll quickly have to get back if you're working as a consultant. So that part certainly resonates. For me, when I became a data consultant, it was it was a little bit less by choice. So it was I had grown sort of tired or sort of not wanting to do my job at the time. And I basically was taking some time and decided to sort of half hang a shingle during sort of like a sabbatical period, and then it turned into something a little bit more meaningful. So yeah. I was more sort of an accidental consultant. There is a real difference between sort of becoming an accidental consultant and really stepping off the ledge. I do want to push you on that, which is I hope that some of the audience is at a place where they could work, and I'm somebody that could get kind of like you mentioned, a tech job. But then there is that really bold step of I don't know where maybe my today paycheck, I know where that's coming from, but I don't know where my 1 month from now paycheck is coming from. How do you sort of I think I wanted this to be sort of a tips and best practices and tricks, and like literally we've talked about none of those things. We've only talked about sort of, like you said, like the personal side of the work, the human side of the work. But I do want to just sort of keep double clicking into that.
Yeah.
What does it take to really feel that confidence? Yes, of course, many of these folks could go back and get sort of we'll call it a real job or a full-time job or a W-2 job or whatever that thing is. But what is it that is, what sort of inspired that courage in you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's definitely a few things. I mean, one, having the privilege of working at Facebook for, I think, a little over 3 years and being frugal, like, I'm like, well, financially, there's no issue, right? Because I think that's one of the big issues that everyone's going to experience is like, where's money coming from? I think the hard factor often there is like, if you have been working at a large tech company, it's not like a small amount of money that you're losing out on, right? Like, it's like, this is not, something that's easy to replace. But in terms of like taking the risk, that's easy. And I think a lot of people, like, if you aren't in that position, it can be scary. So I would recommend most people be in a comfortable financial position. obviously that's not everyone's benefit, but that's part of it. I think the other thing that was helpful was that by that time I was like clearly having like pipelines that worked in terms of like where clients came from. And I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest problem I'd say most consultants have to solve if they want to do it, is like, where are clients coming from? And everyone I think has a different method in terms of how they do it. Every consultant I've talked to, some people are very good at finding people via like Sales Navigator on LinkedIn and knowing exactly who to reach out to. And other people, like me, are very good at like marketing and putting out content, and that just kind of keeps a steady state or steady flow of like inbound leads coming in. Some people are very good at networking. They know how to like go and talk to people. Other people are really good at vendor partnerships, so they're connected with Snowflake or GCP or something, and so they're getting clients that way. But I think as long as you solve that problem, that can kind of give you the confidence, like, hey, like I'm getting like enough inbound leads, or I'm getting enough, if I reach out to people, they're responding and I'm closing deals, that like I could do this, right? Like I don't know if there's a specific number, but like as long as you're getting somewhere in that range of like 70% of what your current income is, you're probably in a place where it's like, yeah, why don't you try? Like more than likely you can at least get 70%. So it's not a terrible position to be in. But if you quit and you're not having to think about another full-time job or something, then you have a ton more free time, which is what happened with me. Like I went from trying to think that I could like somehow still get promoted at Facebook and manage consulting to just having to do consulting, which suddenly I had a lot more free time to think about where are clients coming from, which I was already doing well, but now even more so.
Great. So I do want to touch on the next subject, which is everybody's most important question, which is where do customers come from? But I actually want to go in reverse, which
Okay.
is, sort of the very Facebook thinking, growth is retention. How do you think about sort of not just finding like a client to do maybe a small sort of effort for them, but maybe figuring out ways to have that relationship persist or not when it's not appropriate?
Yeah, I think, as you're kind of building up whatever it is, like if you're doing, let's say, a greenfield project, making sure that you're always kind of selling the next thing. So it's like, hey, like after we land whatever your baseline infrastructure, maybe a simple MVP of a dashboard or something, making sure that you're aware of what their next needs are, I think is always important. Like, hey, how else could we take this data and make it valuable to you? Because that's what they're going to hire you for. They're not going to hire you if there's nothing that they see possible, which they may or may not know what is possible, which is part of, I think, your role as a consultant, which is coming in and saying like, hey, I see this data. Not only can we do this dashboard or whatever that you want, have you ever thought about these other things that you'd want to do? And that could be through having conversations with some of your stakeholders. It could be having conversations with people that aren't even your necessarily stakeholders, but maybe are interested. And just constantly making sure that there's someone internally that is your champion that's like, yeah, we want to do more here. Like we're seeing value from, this phase one. We think a phase two is obviously going to be just as valuable. So I think like having some method to continually sell the next project is always important. Again, whether you're constantly having conversations so you know what those next projects should be, or you kind of have a good repertoire of like, if you're doing a marketing kind of data analytics project, generally what the next marketing project should be, along in terms of the fact that you've just worked on so many. So I think that's kind of the way. The other thing that I think a lot of people will recommend is like, even if you don't get a sale with that customer, it's always worthwhile to see if they can refer you to the next customer as well, right? Like that can also be part of the method of like, hey, maybe you don't retain the specific customer, they don't need you, they're done. But if they're very happy with you, that's the best time to maybe reach out and ask, hey, are there other people that that need this solution or a similar solution? And then finally, I think the last tip is like, make sure you stay in contact with them, like reach out to them every once in a while. Genuinely be like, how are you doing? Are you, are things still working? It's that keeping top of mind, because maybe they were happy with you, they don't need you now, but you want to make sure that the next time they do need you, they're thinking of you and not the next person they happen to Google, because that's how we are. We just tend to pick the thing that is on top of our mind in terms of the solution.
It's always interesting for me to hear just how important like the contact with the stakeholder is. You think of ourselves as being like really technically sound, and if we deliver on sort of the spec or the promise, we'll be either re-upped or or it'll just sort of more business will naturally flow out of that. But actually, kind of like you said, just sort of being able to think one question ahead, being able to, connect with your stakeholder, super critical. So on that, and by the way, actually, if I rewind, something that you said that really hit me is there's no one way of getting these clients, right? So it's sort of whatever your particular strength is. So if you can put out, great content like Ben does, that is a strategy. If you can network the heck out of yourself, that's a strategy. If you like sort of freelance marketplaces, that can be a strategy. If you have sort of already a few sort of clients lined up, that can be a strategy, and build from there with sort of sort of positive virtuous cycle. So I think like there is no one solution, but you generally want to lean into your particular strengths in terms of finding client acquisition. I did a lot of client acquisition initially out of my own network, unsurprisingly, and some of it sort of spun off from there. Sort of transitioning a little bit in terms of what is, you mentioned sort of like a marketing stack as a common and sort of question, or marketing adjacent stack with respect to data. What are the types of common sort of threads or things you build? What are some typical sort of needs in that respect? What does a typical project potentially look like in terms of things that you've built for clients?
Yeah. I mean, I think generally it focuses on three key areas, at least in the data world, right? Like you generally, when you're building stuff and maybe not being less of a consultant in the typical sense where you're just giving an opinion, when you're actually building, generally most people need some level of ingestion, storage, and like BI or analytics. That's generally what they'll pay for, and that's generally the baseline project. So for me, it's like finding something that fits that client in that space. A lot of people will be like, we just like open source, so they'll push for open source solutions because that's just what they want, no matter what, even if it doesn't make sense. You're like, well, you've got one person working here and they're going to have to manage all of those open source solutions. But sure, if that's, I've told you that's not what I'd recommend, but that's what you want, fine. For other people, it's just finding, the right simple solution. Like it's, especially, I think we were talking about this before the call, where maybe I just read a post about this, where like some data teams kind of can feel like they're shrinking and budgets can feel like they're tightening, finding solutions that can support that, right? It's like, okay, well, if you have one person on staff that's going to do all this, you're going to pay more in tools, right? Like, it's like, there still needs to be this work that's done. It's going to come out of your cost in terms of on vendor. So like finding solutions that fit that space, that are maybe that help really simplify getting data from their sources to some sort of final, production table in whatever, BigQuery, Snowflake, whatever you want to pick, Postgres, etc. And then, building dashboards from that. Because like a lot of companies I see are just doing that, where like they'll just dump data, even something like a data lake-esque thing, and then they'll stick Power BI on top of it and, hope for the best. But yeah, trying to figure out what that is, that's both, I think, like maintainable but also reliable, and I think that's usually what you're trying to juggle, which again comes down to like budget, talent, and how much they're willing to expand on those things, or how much they need those things to contract. So
yeah, I think we were talking about this a little bit before this conversation. Obviously, sort of building a data stack on a budget, which requires little maintenance, is something very near and dear to my heart at Mozart Data.
Yes.
But on top of it, I actually do think the context of the data world right now is really important, and is in some sense a really positive note for the data consultants out there. So the current state of, I think we would all sort of agree that the current state of the tech world and the data world especially is that there has been a big contraction in terms of budgets. That's team headcounts, that's team tools, that's a lot more scrutiny on all spend, and mostly sort of SaaS spend. What I think that does is, I do think that creates a lot more opportunity for people to find, I'm an economist by trade. We call it $20 bills lying on the ground. So I think one of the ways that data really expanded in the last 10, 15 years is that once we had the power to actually look at the data, and once data became a little bit more ubiquitous at companies, and companies could easily capture that data, and what we discovered was that there was a variety of like sub-optimizations happening. And typically this would be on the ad side or on the product side. And you could almost prove these with, with ads. There would just be sort of a sort of a statistically significant CAC difference. With product analytics, it'd be sort of real insight into what your customers were doing, and A/B tests that could like highlight and show the value of condition A versus condition B. So that led to a tremendous expansion in terms of investment into this space, maybe even overinvestment given sort of the zero interest rate environment. Unambiguously, the last 2 years has been sort of marked by major contractions, and also probably justifiably so, insofar as it was the case that maybe a lot of these tools and teams were overinvested into. Like, you couldn't find that type of operational excellence. You were doing analytics for analytics' sake. It is very clear to me that with that contraction, I think that that's gone just too far. And that opens up a lot of opportunities for data consultants to actually provide a huge, immense amount of value for these contracted teams. You have one person that's sort of holding up all of maybe this legacy infrastructure or non-existent, data tools that haven't been put into place. I do think that there are ways of sort of small teams implementing that, but I would say that is the real opportunity that we see in the industry. I have a lot of optimism for data consultants as a whole. A little bit off script. Would you sort of generally agree with the conclusion that like the sort of shrinking budgets of internal data teams creates, I mean, you could see it as sort of both ways. Does it create more of an opportunity or a challenge or both? And then what's the sort of angle given the challenge?
Yeah, I definitely can see it as like that both space where it's like, yeah, on one side, and it depends, I think, on how you market yourself, right? On one side, if you are going to continue down the like I'm an expensive consultant route, yeah, maybe it's easy to fall into the no one wants me because they don't have budgets. But I think when people have small budgets or feel like they need to like be more scrupulous with what they're spending, if you're very clear, I think, on what you're offering and in terms of like the value on the other side, I think that becomes an easier buy for people, right? Like, it's like if you can in 90 days take a company from nothing to something in terms of like a data stack, I think that's something they're willing to pay for. If on top of that, like not just the data stack, but like metrics, numbers, things that they can see tangibly and understand, I think that's something that they're willing to pay for. Because if they were to hire someone, even one person to do that, if they have no one on their team, it could easily take more than 90 days, especially if they're newer to the industry and haven't don't know which tools to pick, and they're going to spend 90 days just testing out different ingestion solutions. Like, okay, should I use this one? Should I use this one? If you can just come in and day one be like, here's what I think you need. Let's go, pull that information immediately. Let's deliver quickly. Then I think that becomes valuable to them. I think the other thing that I saw someone else was doing, his name is Luke, he's over in Minneapolis. He's kind of offering this like data team as a service concept where it's like, hey, don't pay for your own data engineer, data analysts, and data scientists. We have that. So instead of paying for all three of those people at once, you'll pay for that fraction of our data team that will do your work when you need it. So the data engineer will come and do the work when they need to do it, then they'll leave. And then, we already have a data analyst that works well with that data engineer. And so I think that's another way of positioning yourself, where it's like, you don't have to look at this as a negative. You just see like, okay, if this is the problem, if there's this kind of shrinking budget or people being more scrupulous, how do we still meet their need? Because they still need a data engineer. They still want to answer questions. They still want to do all of this. How do we meet that need? Have some sort of guarantee with actually meeting that need, and like, maybe not costing as much, or costing as much in the big picture, right? Like, it's like, okay, maybe you're 3 times as much for those 3 months, but after that, you're not getting, they're not paying for you at all, or something like that. So I do think there are definitely benefits to this situation that you can find.
So if I'm echoing it back, I heard a lot of concreteness on the deliverable. So, with a clear value prop and a clear sort of deliverable. Obviously, I am somebody that does not feel like a vanilla data stack should take 90 days to implement.
Yes.
I'm somebody that loves the sort of 90-minute or 90-second version of that, especially if you can get up and running with sort of a very standard set of use cases and then provide the
Yeah.
value in the hard stuff, which is always about understanding the client's like actual business problems, the types of data that would help answer those, and setting up something sort of sustainable and building out a data model and all of the things that are like the actual true challenges as opposed to kind of what historically had been a little bit challenging and had required a number of heads to do, but that's for another time. But I actually would love to double click a little bit into that. How do you think about sort of the full cost of either your services or an implementation? Because like typically you don't just, hire you for an hour and then like, you're done and then, nothing ever to come from that. How do you think about sort of like the full cost end to end? What is the cost of sort of a data consultant, a data stack? How do you think about sort of that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like data consultant, so like let's say whatever your period of time is, I try to do as much as I can viewing is like the value of the solution. Kind of like I referenced earlier, if you were to hire someone, both in terms of like how long it's going to take to hire, all of that, like you can easily spend $100,000 and get nothing on the other side, right? And that's not to talk poorly. It's just like, between all of the ups and downs and I don't know, being an FT is slightly different, especially if you're just hiring someone that's like maybe more junior or mid-level. So to me, it's like if I can deliver something that person couldn't deliver in 90 days or whatever it could be, 60 days, then I think it's more than worth possibly 100K for that deliverable, right? Like if you look at it, you're like, okay, this would take your employee 6 months. I know because I've worked with them. They're going to test out multiple solutions. I've seen it happen where they're like, we want to try out Airbyte and Fivetran and everything else, and can compare how they compete against each other rather than just having a very clear like, hey, let's deliver this mentality. That's kind of how I end up like envisioning the value and pricing there. In terms of like the data stack, I think like it should hopefully in my view like considerably offset a full-time employee's like salary, right? Like what it should be doing and what it's worth is the fact that like instead of having to pay an employee to code, maintain, manage all of these various components, you are getting a solution that does that. Like you said, like whether it's 90 seconds, 90 minutes, etc., you're getting something that does that out of the box. And yeah, maybe there's some custom things you have to do here and there, but overall, it does most of it. And thus, whether you're paying like a fifth of a person or even 2/5 of a person, it is a reasonable expense, I think. I've had a few cases where a solution quoted me like 200K, and this was like a very isolated incident. This is like the opposite side of it, where it's like, this doesn't make sense. They quoted me 200K to ingest data from a single source. And I was like, I could pay an employee to sit there manually and drag that data here like all year, like 200K for that. Like I could pay someone that. And so that's a case where it doesn't make sense, right? Like you have to like envision that as well. If you're a vendor, like if it's going to be an employee cost, I better not be able to hire an employee to do that work. And arguably cheaper than that. So I think that's also another way of viewing it.
Yeah, I would say on the data vendor side, which I am now a lot more familiar with, in general, and this is not just for data vendors, it's for almost any product, you really have to be a 10x solution. You have to be 10x better than whatever the alternative is to really get somebody's attention. And it should be that way, right? So, there's a risk in a sort of adopting a new or different strategy. So in general, you want to be, 1/10 the cost of an FTE. And I would argue the same is true sort of for consulting. Consulting is, in some sense, a data product. There's no difference. I mean, there's a huge difference in what you do and what I do. But there's sort of no difference in that you really want to deliver an immense amount of value with as little work as possible, and that's kind of direction. I realize that we're a little bit over time. That said, I'm enjoying this conversation so much. So we're going to do 15 minutes of Q&A, but I'm going to still ask, we'll start with, maybe one more question first that I often struggled with this, and I thought you'd have a good perspective on it. Yes, we're going to deliver immense amount of value. Then the question becomes, how do we charge for that value? So we're going to create a huge pie, 10x the pie, or 9x the pie that you currently have. And we've got to figure out a way to charge for that. How do we do that? Do we do it by, here's the pie, here's how much you get, here's how much I get? Should we do, that's like sort of like a value-based strategy. Should we say, okay, people can grok time-based strategies. I'll charge you, X dollars per hour. And, this is what I know I pay for my FTE. Therefore, like, this is how much a consultant is worth. How do you think about sort of that sort of very challenging, I think a lot of people, I know that I faced this when I was sort of setting my rates. How do you like to do it? Sort of value-based, time-based, both, something else that I'm not even thinking about. What's your strategy there?
Yeah, I think when I when I definitely started, obviously, like definitely time-based. It's always like, if you're just starting consulting, I think there's like, you'll hear everyone say like you should do value-based or project-based, which makes sense. But if you're just starting out, I don't think there's anything wrong with starting with hourly based, because it gets you an idea of like how long things take, what people are willing to pay for what. I think like when I first started, I was like $100 an hour. This is amazing. Like I was like, I am raking it in. I mean, like, it honestly, if you're making $100 an hour still today, it is a really good salary. I just never realized you could make more. But then you work at Facebook and you're like, okay, now I have to figure out how to charge more than $100 an hour. And so, yeah, you do have to like eventually start positioning it more as this value prop. It's like, well, what is the value of me doing this work, right? If you're hiring me and I am charging you, again, like $100,000 for like, let's say 3 months, if this project isn't worth, like, you kind of give a good number, like $1 million or at least $500,000, because there's the risk of it failing, right? There's the risk of it not delivering. There is this argument to be made that you should probably not be doing that work, right? Like, it's like, okay, should we even be doing this work? But I think that goes the same way as like, if you hire someone, again, you're going to spend $100,000, $200,000 for them in a year. If they deliver this thing by the end of the year, is it still not worth that $1 million? So I do think like that's kind of how I'll often pitch it. Is like, I would like to give you something that in time returns you that $500 or $1 million. You can see that you get those insights, you get confidence, you get to answer these questions that you don't currently have answered, and hopefully that is that ROI. So that's generally how I position that conversation, right? I think also some things with me at this point is like, I do have my own minimums where it's like, hey, if it isn't worth this much to you, that's fine, but it's not worth this much for me to work on this project anymore. So there's also that balance where it's like, as you start growing as a consultant, you just start being more upfront with like, hey, I want to work on projects that are worth this $1 million, $5 million for you. Otherwise, it's not even really worth it for me to kind of take on the work. So
I have a little bit of a different perspective, and
okay.
I think you shared it, and I have something sort of similar to something that you shared with me in the past, which is you do sort of graduate up from being, charging by the hour to charging by the project to charging by the value. And I think you sort of have to either prove yourself within a client or with sort of like an adjacent client, that they could see that value, and then you can step your way up. But I think your comment leads into the first of our Q&A, which I think is one that I want to ask you. And it's a little bit of a first-class problem. And I think you're going to be excellent at answering this, because this is probably a problem that you face, which is, just to echo what James asked, and sort of change it around a little bit. He and his business partner are like full up. They've sort of, there's a certain amount that they want to work. And yes, there's, 168 hours in a week. They're probably not doing that, but they're working sort of as much as they're sort of fully utilized. There's multiple ways to scale once you're sort of fully utilized as a person. You can have somebody else do it and charge a margin on that. You can expand your team. You can simply charge a higher rate and then be, lose some more marginal customers and then be less fully utilized, and then, get more customers that are willing to pay the higher rate. Curious as to your advice. Now, again, I don't think this is a common problem, but this is a good problem, and I do think you are well positioned to answer this. what's the best way to scale? Is it hire more folks? Is it to have higher rates? Is it both? Does it depend on your ambitions? What's your quick take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be dependent upon what business you would like to work on. Would you like to be a person in the future that's making, whatever your target is, $1 million a year, just by yourself, or you and your business partner splitting down to $1 million a year because you're doing, again, full work, but you're charging $500 an hour? Is that your goal? Is that something you'd like to do? Like, you just want to be working on higher level problems where, you're basically just talking to CEOs and giving them like digital transformation kind of advising. On the flip side, you could also build this company that gets to $30 million a year, where you're still only probably keeping, 1 to 2 million of it, but it's because you're, scaled out and you have 30 employees that are working for you. And I think that is the other side. On the other side, the pros and cons of that is like you lose control, right? Like, I mean, you have some control, but like you're giving your trust into other people, right? Like, you have to be willing to be open to the fact that people will make different decisions than you. They'll make mistakes that are different than the ones that you're going to make. They're not going to be as into it as you are, right? It's not their company. Like, they can only be so into it, right? Like, even if they think you're an amazing boss, it's not their company unless you give them some level of equity. And so that's one trade-off. And on the other side, you have control. You are 100% involved. You are always the person who's going to be, on the phone call when something goes wrong. And so I think part of that's going to be like, what world do you want to live in? What problems would you prefer dealing with? You want to be more of a person that's constantly finding work, because that's going to be your job on the side of an agency. Your job is, I need to find work for these 30 people that I have working for me. Or do you want to be the person doing work that, again, spends some time finding work, but it's like actually getting to do the work that you're finding? So depends on the future you want in your life, the lifestyle you want, things like that.
Yeah, I don't think you dodged that question, but I think you answered it sort of correctly, which is you really could see it in some sense both ways, and it depends a little bit about your own personal preference and working style. In the same way that when we answered the question, how do you get new clients? It depends. If you're somebody that loves producing content, that's a tool. If you're somebody that loves going to network at events, that's a tool. If you're somebody with a big network, that's a tool. And the same with this, which is if you're somebody that likes doing the high level selling and sort of more traditional consulting, which is sort of removing yourself from the actual like hands-on keys, then you can probably then you can scale by hiring. And if you're somebody that has a high standard on their work product, that wants to be sort of in the muck, that sort of loves doing that work, then you could probably scale via charging for that expertise. To that end, how do you stay on top of the tool? How do you not get rusty, right? So if you work at, say, a company with large data like a Microsoft or a Facebook, you're dealing with billions or trillions of rows every day, and you're trying to figure out sort of strategies around it and just observations after observations. But you sort of do it within the context of a mature stack.
Yeah.
You have the risk of getting rusty that way. If you are sort of just opining at a high level and selling consulting work, you have a true risk of getting rusty. How do you personally not get rusty?
Yeah, I mean, me personally, I do a bit of both projects, so I think that helps. I'm always open to getting hands-on. I enjoy being hands-on, and I will always, I think, try to spend at least a certain percentage of my time being hands-on, because, like you said, that's where you constantly make sure you're staying on top of your skills. Early on in your career, you spend a ton of time building this base, right? Like being like, okay, I'm technical, I'm learning how to do whatever data structures and algorithms, write SQL, data modeling, etc. But yeah, if you're too far away from it, too far removed, you just become you get in this interesting position where it's like you kind of forget it all, and like you're still giving advice on it, but it's like, but can you really give as good advice as you could if you were just spending a little bit of time? I don't think you have to spend like 80% of your time at a certain point. I think as long as you're spending like 20% of your time still in that space, still kind of working on those problems, I think you'll keep it fresh enough to where it's like, okay, I can still solve these problems. You don't want to ever be in that situation where you don't have some ability to talk to that level of like, okay, how do I solve this, performance optimization issue? And
Yeah.
I think, oh, go ahead.
I mean, I think there's like honestly an ego in a good way of a lot of the best data consultants I know, that they still got it, that they still can do this work. And there's an authenticity to that. You know, they don't feel like they could sell work that they don't legitimately feel like they could offer expertise into. So that's kind of been my experience kind of in the data world, seeing folks that have been wildly successful at this are still really great at their craft.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it.
Okay, so we do just have 1 minute. If there are any last minute questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if not, Ben, how can folks get in touch with you or learn more about data consulting via you, or anything that, you know, to either plug or mention before we head off?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, you guys can find me under Seattle Data Guy on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Ben Rogojan. Luckily, my name is pretty distinct, I think, that way. So I show up pretty quickly. I try to write occasionally about consulting, so you'll find that on LinkedIn. I did put together a quick course to help people like jumpstart into consulting. So generally post about that on LinkedIn as well. So you'll find tons of tidbits from me, pretty much on most platforms.
Yeah. And at Mozart Data, obviously, we work very closely with the data consultant community, especially in the SMB space. I'm Pete at Mozart Data, but you can find us on all of the social channels. As Mozart Data, we are an easy onboarding into a modern data stack, a modern data platform. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us.
Yeah.
A lot of questions that I had, mostly similar perspectives, a few different ones, but I really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody for joining, and don't hesitate to follow up with any questions.
Yeah. Thank y'all.